Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon. It's my very great honor to welcome and host Peter Funke. He's an associate professor of politics at the University of South Florida. He's also graduate director at the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, also at University of Florida. He teaches courses on social movements, Europe, politics of development, global political economy, and Marxism, as well as the German Beyond the Classroom Study Abroad program. His research focuses predominantly on social movements, capitalism and class, media and technology, and Peter has published in various peer-reviewed journals such as South Atlantic Quarterly, Globalizations, New Media and Society, Rethinking Marxism, and so on. He has also been the co-editor of The Great Refusal. This is the name of the book, The Great Refusal, Herbert Marcuse and Contemporary Social Movements, and another excellent book, The New Global Politics, Global Social Movements in the 21st Century. So it's just morning hours for Peter. He's joining us from Florida this morning. So I'm very grateful that he's here with us. Most importantly, before I forget to mention, Peter was also my dissertation advisor, the best one ever, very patient with many of my drafts and ideas and whatnot. And he's also a great friend, expert on social movements. So I really hope that we'll have a fruitful discussion today. So before I give the floor to Peter, I would just say a few words about the seminar, if that's okay, and the structure, the idea that we have how to really proceed today. So if everybody agrees, then we can start without any further ado. So the name of today's talk is Narrative Power in an Era of Crisis and Convergence. And this is at the same time a name of an article which Peter recently published with two other colleagues at South Atlantic Quarterly. And our idea today is to have him present for about 10-15 minutes, talking about what inspires his research on social movements and what are really some structural features that he's taking account of in his research precisely. Then I can actually, if that's okay with you, Peter, I can also share maybe on chat your article so that everybody else can also have access to that article. I'm not sure if it is open access because Peter sent it to me. So after he really sets the stage for our discussion and the way he's approaching the study of social movements, we were thinking about going over some key terms introduced in that article. And why is that? Because we believe that these key terms can be applied to different contexts, including in the Balkans. After we conclude this little overview with the key concepts from the article, which is going to be about 20 minutes, then we would like to open the floor to everybody else for Q&A. So how does that sound to everybody? Okay. And since Peter is really interested in learning about your backgrounds and interests so that he can also tailor his introduction towards maybe, like different backgrounds or your specific research interests, I wanted to ask if at least some of you would like to say a few words about your background and the research that you're currently doing in this fellowship. Or even maybe I can kindly ask Sanya to just say a little bit about the group, which will, no, okay, we'll skip Sanya. So let's just open the floor to people just to introduce themselves if that's okay. And then we're just gonna move on.
Okay, hello Peter, hello Dragana.
Hello.
Hello everyone, my name is Srđan, I'm calling in from Belgrade, Serbia. It's very nice to see you and joining this webinar. In this fellowship I was working and finally submit my first draft of the work to my mentor on actually looking at how the postponement of political decisions in environmental protection actually leads to increase in vulnerability among the young generations, because I have been working on policy for many years and I have discovered that people like me, 40 plus, actually create the policies for the young generation without considering what the needs and the future for this generation needs. So basically, I'm actually using the voices of young generation to express their feelings, their thoughts around that, and also would like to use that the outcomes of the research also in my policy work, because I'm meeting with the decision makers. So I really want to have that in hand to actually share among those who has to hear about the younger generations.
Thank you. I'm guessing there's also the same demographic skewing in, like we see all throughout Europe, or is it as bad, that sort of
I guess this is like something that is happening across the world, I guess, but I've been looking in between 18 and 35 age.
Okay.
Yeah, across the Western Balkan region.
Yeah.
Okay, hello, Peter. Thank you for joining us for this seminar today. Thank you for Dragana for organizing. I'm Vanya. I'm from Macedonia, from North Macedonia, and my research here in the fellowship is more about the migration of youth, considering that Western Balkan is a region for a bigger, let's say, outward migration in the, let's say, past years. I'm trying to see what the migration futures of young people in North Macedonia are, how they're envisioning it in relation to the migration resolution that the government is working on for 2026-30, and with an idea that hopefully this vision of young people and their voices will be implemented in the new migration resolution of the country. So,
yeah, thank you.
I could also maybe introduce myself. Nice to meet you, Peter. My name is Anastas Vangeli. I'm based at the University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. As part of this project, I'm looking at basically, I'm trying to find out whether we can come up with some new vocabulary to capture the orientations among Gen Z youth. In general, I work on a bunch of things. I spent quite a lot of time in China, so I'm looking at this global battle of ideas, imagineers, and so on and so on. I just want to say I'm familiar with your work actually, because in my past life I was a social movement activist. Also was doing some stuff on social movements. Have met people, Podemos, Syriza, and all that. So also have been doing quite a lot of work on the Zapatistas.
Yeah.
Like 20 years ago when I was starting. So. It's good to put a face to the name. So
yes, so we have similar roots. Zapatista was also my beginnings.
wow, would be good to talk at some point about it.
Yes.
Anybody else? Do we have Montenegro? Is Nemanja here? So at least one person from each country. I'm not sure if he's here. Nemanja. Okay, maybe later on,
Yeah.
in the Q&A, people can also contextualize their research before they ask you questions. Again, as I was saying earlier, if everybody is okay with that, I will initially ask what has inspired you, Peter, to study social movements, and how do you approach the movement dynamics?
Yeah, first, thank you. Thank you, Dragana, for inviting me, and thank you for the center for hosting this event, and thank you all for coming. It was great to hear some of the project, and there's certainly, I think, overlap. That doesn't mean that I'll be able to speak to your projects, and I will also try to keep my remarks in that time frame. I might go a little over, so just stop me if I'm, rambling along. So I maybe sort of I start with two assumptions, sort of, or sort of starting points, if you will, for my work. And sort of the most basic one is that the starting point of it all for me is the political economy and basic sort of capitalism, which I believe constitutes sort of the deep grammar, if you will, of the human condition. And as Bertolt Brecht in the Three-Penny Opera famously said, Fressen kommt vor der Moral, food first, then morality. So in order to live and reproduce, we first need to eat. Put differently, all is grounded for me in the political economy, in the material, economic, institutional realities, and thus for my understanding in my work and analysis of capitalism is then sort of central and a foundational part. And the second one that Dragana sort of mentioned, and some of you worked on too, is if I look at change, good and bad, historically, I suppose, it has been movements. It has been collective action, really, that brought about change, rather than the often claimed older, white, individual, male that graciously gave us something. It seems more often than not that it has been through collective action, through struggle, that also a better world came about. And the examples, of course, are all over, from the Haitian and French Revolution, anti-colonialism, feminism, environmentalism, of course, the labor movement, sort of the examples are almost endless. And so as a colleague mentioned, I sort of started also studying social movement around the time that the global justice movement emerged. That's in the late 1990s, early 2000s, kind of to remind us a time when globalization accelerated, trade agreements, multinational corporations, financial institutions gained influence, but also organizers around the world began sort of to challenge this brave new world order, sort of on the basis of exponentially, and since then, only stronger, increasing economic inequalities, environmental damages, labor exploitations, lack of democratic accountabilities, especially in these global institutions. And so the global justice movement sort of gained global attention through protests at international summits, the World Trade Organization, at the G8 meetings, that's a group of 8 countries, the IMF meetings, and of course the iconic so-called Battle of Seattle protests against the World Trade Organization in November of 1999, which helped stop trade negotiations at that time and really prevented, I would argue, the WTO from functioning as this tool of neoliberal policies that it has been since its inception in 1995. Of course, also the global justice movement found expression in various social forums, sort of the World Social Forum as the big national meeting. The idea was sort of, instead of just reacting, or my interpretation of it is, instead of just reacting to meetings of the elites, movements, global movements, transnational movements, try to sort of also build their own forums where they would meet and so be more proactive. And you had the World Social Forum, of course, sort of mirroring, if you will, the World Economic Forum, right? Sort of the World Social Economic Forum elites meeting by individual invitation only versus everyone who is allowed to attend the World Social Forum, except, by the way, those that supposedly use violence. So funny in a certain sense, the Zapatistas weren't allowed to join. Also, World Social Forum, of course, are in Porto Alegre, the Global South, Brazil, versus Davos, Switzerland. For the World Economic Forum, the focus on economic, that is capitalism, for the World Economic Forum, and the World Social Forum sort of focus on social aspects. Now, if we kind of look at or sketch the development of the global justice movement with the 9/11 attacks in 2001, it really started, I would argue, to decline. Also because the political landscape really changed, right? You got tightened security and increasing state surveillance here in the US, including the Patriot Act. Organizing also shifted towards anti-war movements, sort of Afghanistan, Iraq at the time, and then also internal debates over tactics led to fragmentation, the idea of horizontal organizing structures, grassroots organizing, how to sort of integrate already organized groups like labor, for instance. To be clear, though, the movement did, of course, not entirely disappear. Many activists shifted to local campaigns, while its core anti-liberal, anti-neoliberal, and anti-war and pro-environmental ideologies were adopted by later movements, if we think of Occupy Wall Street as an example. Now, the other element that sort of relates to the first point I made is that sort of the global justice movement or the anti-globalization movement or the alter-globalization movement also came about during a particular variation of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. And maybe let me say briefly or sketch kind of the evolution, or rather the making into and making of neoliberalism, as well as what I regard today as its current, if you will, twilight times. So again, this is sort of a stylized, of course, history, and there's always sort of issues with periodization and sort of, because periods bleed into each other. Nevertheless, let me sort of say a little bit on sort of how I understand, not only I, many others too, sort of that kind of progression or that development. So in a certain sense, after World War II, economic elites succeeded in negotiating and eventually co-opting trade unions into fairly stable industrial relations. In the global north, the so-called Fordist compromise was characterized by mass consumption to uphold expanding production through rising wages and a semi-welfare state, guaranteeing a minimum of standards of living. Fordism was, however, more than merely an economic arrangement. It was a total, as Harvey put it, quote, it was, quote, a total way of life. Mass production meant standardization of the product as well as mass consumption, and that meant a whole new aesthetic and commodification of culture, unquote. So beyond the strictly economic implications, Fordism also referred to a social cultural system of homogenization and management, the standardization, if you will, of life. A well-known illustration, of course, is the quote-unquote sociological department by Henry Ford in order to socially manage workers and defining a satisfactory worker as showing, quote, cleanliness, good manhood, proof of marriage, and prohibiting one's wife from working outside the home, unquote. So by the mid-60s, though, this Fordist compromise started to unravel, and increasing deregulation, privatization, and liberalization programs expanded and deepened the scope of the capitalist logic into formally public social spheres such as education, retirement, or healthcare. Today, there's increasing consensus, I think, across the social sciences that these massive shifts in the international political economy altered the speed, mobility of capital, goods, people, and ideas across space and time. These shifts toward neoliberal capitalism can be characterized as a project of, and again, I'm quoting Harvey here, quote, deregulation, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision in order to achieve the restoration of class power of the ruling classes, unquote. So this neoliberal restructuring process changed the global nature and composition also of labor and the working class and social movement practices in general. Under Fordism, the capitalist political economy was dominated by large plants, mines, docks, workers, shared in close physical and socio-cultural life and work worlds and politics. Consequently, sort of Marxist scholars like Aronowitz conceptualized the working class as predominantly those that worked in factories. The ongoing neoliberalization processes, however, are both expanding and fragmenting the working class, expanding by pulling new sectors of the population into the capitalist profit and commodification logic, and fragmenting as the working class is arguably more isolated than their predecessors under Fordism. As such, increasingly atomized and isolated work and social environments define human existence today. Especially those most disaffected by neoliberal capitalism find themselves increasingly disconnected from their fellow men, no longer converging at conveyor belts or union meetings, but coping with daily existence that appear increasingly unrelated. The commonalities between, for instance, students, nurses, cab drivers, metal workers, servers, janitors, or fishermen are arguably less obvious and less quickly understandable than they were during Fordism, which was characterized by much more standardized life and work environments. And this in turn produces a more pronounced need for increased communication to bridge these alleged differences, generating the need for thicker communicative processes to form a coherent movement and class identity. So in some, novel dynamics of social movement formations are emerging. Let me maybe say a little bit on the kind of the current, or how I understand or part of how, or try to understand how what the current moment is. So it seems there's again sort of growing consensus that the multiple crises of our times, economic, political, ideological, are expressions of the decline in this once dominant neoliberal framework. Cox-Nielsen referred to this as the twilight of neoliberalism. And this is indicative of what Antonio Gramsci in the prison notebooks named an organic crisis of the ruling order. When the foundations upon which a social order rests begin to crack, Gramsci reminds us, the ruling class increasingly loses its ability to forge consent around it, its political programs, and establish ruling ideologies. While its foundations started to unravel with the Great Recession of 2008, the COVID pandemic has only magnified the socioeconomic dislocations of a failing neoliberal project and has partially unmoored the persistent rootedness of neoliberalism in both elite and popular subjectivities, culminating in the recent war making from Venezuela and Cuba to Iran. Still, an quote undead neoliberalism has so far sustained itself despite a looming crisis of its core logics. Parties cling to the tenets of neoliberalism and sustained allegiances to adjacent ideological fundamentalism, here in the US, MAGA, authoritarianism, nativism, and so on. And despite the state's insistence on defending financial capital's dominance, the post-2008 neoliberal doctrine is, I would argue, no longer hegemonic in economic or political terms, nor the presumed ruling ideology holding sway over popular classes. Nevertheless, there have been various crises, tendencies, and ruptural moments of neoliberalism since its inception, recovery from which is one of the more bizarre core attributes and abilities of neoliberalism to adapt and to internal and external contradictions with durability and mutuability. Indeed, neoliberalism does not only depend on its legitimacy, which has routinely and historically been put into crisis, but as Peck describes it, neoliberalism, it fails, but it tends to fail forward. Given the significance of this moment, the nature of contestation is more than ever a determinant factor in the passage from this current conjuncture to the next. And I emphasize this contingency of this moment, which is in no way predetermined or merely a question of the end of neoliberalism as we know it. There are multiple futures on the table, including the reactionary and counter-revolutionary consolidation of state and capitalist power via the reconsolidation of neoliberalism. The co-optation of working class leaders and ideas, what Gramsci called transformismo, or the rise of new social forces whose alliances may capture hegemony around an as yet unarticulate program. There are, however, many indications that the rise of insurgent forces, both far right and left, that are not yet coherent in the wake of a deepening organic crisis will determine the perils and possibilities of the current moment, and whose agendas will furthermore determine the principles of how and for whom the crisis will be resolved in either ruin or reclamation of class power. So I don't know, am I okay with time? Do I still have some? Yeah, okay. So recognizing this current conjuncture, I want to explore maybe in the remaining time that I have, and Dragana, you tell me when it's over, the role of media in cohering of social struggles by anti-systemic social movements. So transforming structural relations of media and their tactical uses are key components of shifting the terrain upon which such movements build. In response to this deepening organic crisis, I want to suggest I want to sort of argue for the importance of moving beyond the echo chamber by building new narrative blocks as bases of power that can serve as one of several determining factors for the direction of popular movements and the generalization of new notions and political programs around which a counter-hegemonic consensus may emerge for society. Indeed, as colleagues sort of in that piece that Dragana mentioned, and I have argued, transformative resistance and collective power will depend on the ability to use movement-based media infrastructure to deepen international communication and processes and relationships to an ongoing global mass movement against the rise of anti-democratic politics, popular authoritarianism, and other morbid symptoms of this declining order. In order to trace how media movements might intervene in the horizon of possibilities which comprise our collective future, we would need to start, I think, with the landscape from which they emerged in the neoliberal era and the ensuing epoch of anti-systemic movements, from the Zapatistas that we mentioned earlier to the beginnings of a new wave of worker struggles that first gained traction at the onset of that twilight of neoliberalism, sort of around the 2008s to 2010s, and has since really erupted on the heels of the pandemic. Second, informed by these shifting neoliberal imperatives in the current crisis, I want to suggest that the political economy of media, the wider state apparatus, the neoliberal capitalist relations have imposed an important structural imperative on movements that will need to be confronted. Movements, therefore, must take critical stock of the effects of the capitalist political economy in general and the political economy of media in which they operate, and as such engage and oppose capitalist dynamics in their use and creation of media. Relatedly, the role dominant corporate media technologies occupy as a would-be suture for class consciousness must be routed to new media orientations that reclaim autonomy and self-determination as principles of communicative struggle. And so as such, third, I draw on, or in this piece, we draw on Gramsci's concept of the historical bloc to argue that in the context of an unfolding organic crisis, a new strategic opportunity arises for narrative blocs to facilitate the convergence of social forces capable of disrupting and dismantling existing narratives of the dominant ruling powers by creating new narratives that transform existing relationships with media and state apparatus. These narrative blocks are not created out of whole cloth, but rather emerge through conscious coordination among existing channels of organizing. Their strategic development requires a new orientation to organize with media that creates organizational mass power, a crucial role for building class and social power bases largely missing from the dominant organizing tendencies that we see that are focused on either policy-based mobilization, electoral-based mobilization, or street-based mobilization, sort of last one here, sort of the no kings one. And there's this distinction between kind of mobilizing and organizing, and those two, we might come back to, but are certainly sort of related, but different. So what remains vital at stake in the potentiality of movement media is the ability on a mass scale to address outrage, repair the fissures and splinters in class solidarity, prepare the grounds for multiracial alliances, and build shared and common platforms from a range of experiences and perspectives. This critical approach, I want to suggest, may better position movements to engage effectively on the terrain of media, as well as prepare for material and ideological struggles within and against the neoliberal state. So as successive rollback and roll-out waves of neoliberalism have transformed market and state relations, each stage of its advance has been met with local and global resistance. In its overcoming of resistance through state-sanctioned repression and innovative marketized co-optation, as well as its history and ongoing co-articulation with the political economy of media, what neoliberalism is and does has profoundly shifted over time. Its anti-democratic core is the basis of a complex hegemony that has in part defined the evolving nature of resistance to it. Those challenges have manifested in and through new media struggles. This broader epoch of anti-systemic contention stretches, as I said earlier, back at least 40 years to the rise of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation and the birth of the subsequent global justice movement, in which communication constituted an important terrain of struggles against neoliberalism. Both of those were deeply rooted rebellions against the colonial and corporate underpinnings of the neoliberal global economy and the multinational architecture of neoliberal policies and institutions used to subordinate the global South, before returning to source in the wave of privatization and wage attack in North Atlantic societies. This cycle of struggle at the so-called end of history, which heralded or was supposed to herald a triumphant new world order, an age of global capitalist market consolidation at the disintegration of the Soviet Union, put anti-capitalist and anti-colonial revolutions on the table, guided by the translocal and international coordination of the most dispossessed and disenfranchised of the earth, alongside the exploited and indebted of those closest to the core centers of the global economy. This global communication was part of an, if you want, electronic fabric of struggle, accomplished largely by the creation of a new autonomous media infrastructure, email lists, websites, newspapers, radio stations, electronic bulletins, built as part of networks that crisscross the core and peripheral geographies of this new global economy. The movement created, disseminated, and modeled the use of tactical media, fashioning old and new digital technologies into a global communication network that put people's narratives first. For an all too brief few years, projects like Indie Media effectively and consistently challenged or tried to challenge corporate agendas of established media, locally, nationally, and internationally. If there's time, I'm happy to talk a little about narrative blocks, if you want me?
Yes, that would be amazing. Maybe to yes.
Or we can open up. I'm as much interested to hear from others, sort of how they understand the current situation, how they understand struggles, also in your parts of the world that you're familiar with. It doesn't have to be me just talking and questioning. I would love to have it sort of more of a conversation, but.
Yes, because this was so amazing. It was excellent in terms of really postulating some key terms for us to engage with. So Peter basically really explained this economic structure, like globally speaking, but also at the same time social relations, and then how ideas and institutions and also media come together to really form this stable alignment of material forces, but also ideologies such as neoliberalism and institutions. Actually, one of the questions that I had, and maybe we can start with this question and then obviously open up, because I would also like to provide the opportunity to others, because we talk a lot and we have this privilege to stay in touch and discuss what's going on in Serbia and elsewhere. But yes, I was thinking about the role of communication and media, and obviously your works helps me a lot in analyzing and articulating these avenues of opportunities in the specific context in Serbia. So during the student movement over the last year and a half now, or actually 2 years, close to 2 years, there has been different attempts of students to point out to the state-controlled issues with the state-controlled media outlets, and how the state is able to constantly create a specific narrative, only present one part of the story, and due to this saturation of information from the state-controlled or pro-regime media, often even these attempts to articulate their own narrative and to speak about alternative somehow stayed awake, because their answer was always reactionary, because the state would always, they would create narratives about students that they're terrorists, that they're traitors, that they're this or that. So they would have to engage to counter this type of accusations. So that's really taking a lot of, energy and their efforts. And it's taking away their energy from articulating this possible counter narrative, something more affirmative, and what reality and social justice and whatnot could really look like. So maybe if you can say a little bit more about just the role of state in those other examples that you studied or encountered. And at the same time, if you don't mind, this is almost like a little sub-question about offline and online strategies, because some scholars really emphasize the online and the digital activism as a way of mobilizing, but not so much organizing, but some point out to both. And the Arab Spring, during Arab Spring, like we have a lot of literature that was published afterwards and whatnot. So just if you can say a little bit more about the role of state, and on the other hand, offline and online spheres of struggles.
Great, yes. So with the Zapatistas, really, let me start with the state, some comments. Sort of the Zapatistas famously sort of argued or said, that when they looked at then they tried to find the Mexican state, they didn't see the state, they saw capitalist flows, and there was a whole debate about, is the state withdrawing and state power, and so you get, the protests, many of them at the international financial institutions, right, at the World Trade Organization, rather than at the doors of the Treasury Department in the US, for instance. And that was quite influential, in sort of with the global justice movement, sort of to kind of, I would argue, to kind of disregard the state. And in hindsight, at least, I would argue that might have been premature. Sort of that what we see is actually a coming back of the state, or put differently, the state never vanished. The state just changed dramatically in what its functions were, right? If we think about neoliberalism, one of the arguments that the proponents, the libertarians are making, that the state is withdrawing. Well, no, and the state is weakening, and you get freedoms and all these things that are so beautiful. But that, I would argue, is not the case. The state, you need a very strong state in neoliberalism that can sort of guarantee property rights, that can sort of make sure that regulations are, meaning red tape, or rather, child labor regulations are sort of not enforced, and so on. So I think the state changed its kind of outlook, if you will, but it's still here. And so I think that's one element of it. I think there's another element sort of that I didn't mention, but I think that plays a great role in understanding kind of the current logic of social movement organizing in this, if you will, epoch of struggle, is the end of the real existing state socialist projects with the end of the Cold War, and the discrediting of any of kind of these kind of ways of thinking about change within the left. And so you get sort of almost like a anarchist type of left that sort of has escapist kind of elements, but that really sort of tries to sidestep the state in that period. Now, of course, it's never kind of that clear cut as I try to portray it here. So everything is much more messy. But you get then, I think, sort of a rediscovering of the state as a real and important, if not the important, arena of change, right? You get that with sort of the electoral campaigns of Corbyn in Britain, of Bernie Sanders in the US, the whole pink tide, kind of that leftish kind of taking over of governments in Latin America. So I think this kind of, in that way, the state is back. Even the Zapatistas went on a so-called listening tour and took part in presidential elections, not recently, but sometime. I don't know where they're at right now, but they used to do that. And my colleague might know better than me, who sort of spoke about that. So the state in that way, I think, is back as a terrain of contestation, and I think rightfully so. I think it's one of the areas, not the only one, but it's one of the areas that progressive politics, or the politics that I would like to see more, needs to kind of engage. With that, of course, also sort of maybe one comment, I don't know whether that gets at your question, but one other comment is sort of course, that whole media environment of corporate media, and sort of, the social media and the way that indie media was around is in the 1990s or 2000s is a very different one, I think, than what we see now with Meta and Google, these huge, juggernauts of sort of, capitalism, and sort of the power they kind of have. And there was always this element, sort of, I remember that within the media, you know, that in sort of the Western world, whatever, the liberal democratic world, you have the right to speak, but you don't necessarily have the right to be heard, right? So some people are more free in being heard. Everyone can say what they want, but that's maybe not enough. You also need to be somehow heard, right? So there's that, and that is still, I think, still sort of an issue. Now on online, offline organizing, it's great that you mentioned that, because what comes to mind is that I remember at the time, sort of, that I think it was the New York Times who talked about Twitter revolutions and Facebook warriors, and sort of, you know, and again, sort of, I think that new media, the internet, online is a important tool, sort of, in organizing for movements and for struggles, but certainly only one among in the toolkit. And there's this fear of clicktivism, right? That you're sort of on Facebook or wherever people are now, so you click on it, and that way you have done your social justice work. That doesn't seem to, you know, that in itself doesn't seem to be kind of, you know, the way to do it. Nevertheless, sort of the fastness of things, the organizing, kind of the way that I start to understand also of this No Kings movement that happened, or these protests in the US. I mean, that is all powered also by these new technologies, and a little bit maybe sort of with kind of the autonomous markets, right? There's sort of the reappropriation of technologies is something that the left should not be afraid of doing, and certainly they're not. But only online, of course, I think is not kind of cutting it, if you will.
Yeah, it's not gonna do the job.
No.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
This explains a lot, and I would like, obviously, others to also have the opportunity. So if you agree, maybe we can open the floor for a few other questions. So please, guys, go ahead. Some of these topics, and I know your research doesn't target specifically youth and youth agency, but obviously it's part of it. So some of my colleagues really did a great job studying agency of youth in the Balkans. So maybe they can share what they discovered offline and online, and maybe some challenges that they're in.
Could I ask a question there that they might or might not sort of address when it comes, because I'm always curious, sort of so I'm originally from Germany, and sort of the source, or the, you know, where the kernel, the beginnings of change, it has been campuses, right? Have been sort of students, right? That's where, I mean, if we look historically, not always, of course, I mean, there's labor movement and so on, but especially sort of in, you know, post 60s, if you will. And so if I look at my campus here, and again, sort of, it's of course different if I look at, you know, Harvard, or, you know, we saw sort of the clamping down. The students seem to be much more conservative, or much less political than sort of, than what in my imagination maybe only I envisioned the times before. Now then I look at, and sort of Dragana and I'm still having to catch up, but we're trying to of course work on those processes in Serbia. That doesn't seem to necessarily be the case in Serbia, right? Where sort of the youth seem to be a real massive actor. In any case, if nobody has to, but if anyone wants to address kind of if that is, or it might also be just USF that has sort of a conservative students, or more conservative student body than others. In any case.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, we also discussed that when I was presenting my research, how it also depends on defining political and activism, and because maybe we're still trapped, because I did some surveys and I also point out to specific ways to engage and whatnot. But if we look at some informal ways, you know, like through some sort of philanthropy, or even, you know, like some grassroots stuff, maybe then we can broaden this area of political and see that they're still out there, maybe just in, you know, like some modified ways. And some of other colleagues discovered the similar things in countries where they come from, or campuses. But yeah, let's see what others have to say and ask or add to what we just discussed.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Oh, yes,
Yeah,
Anastasia. Yes.
I would like to deepen on this point that was maybe partially touched upon, and I'm bringing here my experience as educator, so I'm also teaching to students, and what I notice is increasing popularity of this right-wing, alt-right sort of ideology, but now that's kind of the revolutionary ideology. That's the cool thing. I mean, I don't want to judge it morally, normatively. I mean, we all have our opinions and sentiments, but to me, it's puzzling, especially, some of the carriers and the most potent figures are, let's say, these tech billionaires and all that. So how do we make sense of that? Like it was, I mean, there was always this, let's say, libertarian current, but I could have never envisioned it to kind of become so potent, especially merged with, let's say, more kind of conservative forces. It's all expert of the US. Like we have to blame the US for this. But yeah, if you have any take on that. So
could I sort of first, what is your, what would be your attempt to try and understand why sort of that alt-right is now kind of the cool? Do you have any sense?
I mean, I don't have a coherent explanation. One of my, so I'm thinking along the lines of like a pendulum swing. So I think at some point the left wing, the social movements, let's say in response to so I trace everything in my work, I trace everything to the global financial crisis. I don't know, maybe that was the defining moment in my life, being growing up. But let's say, and if you see like the initial response to the global financial crisis was this left-wing reaction from Occupy movement to to Spain, to Greece, to all these places. But very soon after, you had like this new right-wing populism taking place, and in some points, like the right-wing criticism, and of course not everything is just like, a lot of it is also has to do with post-socialist Europe. Actually, I spent also time in Hungary, so just at the time when Orban was coming to power. So so one thing is I guess there was quite a lot of potent left-wing reaction to what happened, but it kind of lost the momentum. I think a big part of that was, how Syriza ended up, how Bernie Sanders rose, but never really, like, it was anticlimactic. And so I guess many people were disillusioned with the left, because I'm thinking also not just of like activists who are reading and writing and all, but like, just people going as followers. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, has to do with how it's infused through social media platforms. But I don't have a coherent explanation, actually. Like we could always go back to how fascism rose, and how in crisis nationalist ideas rise, and this. What is interesting to me, that part of the diagnosis that they have is actually, not so different to what would be a left-wing diagnosis, that global forces have essentially produced certain inequalities. And so, however, they frame it as more of a pressure on identity, expression of national self, and so on and so on. So I don't know. Like, that's my.
No, I agree with much all of what what you mentioned. I think sort of for me, what I would add is that, I mean, theoretically, fascism historically has been kind of a reply to capitalist crises. You could argue, and sort of if you look at Germany, for instance, it wasn't really the working class; it was kind of the lower middle classes together with the elites that forged that kind of bloc, if you will, that brought the Nazis to power. So that's sort of the most theoretical, if you will. But I think the other one is also that the left really, the shock of the end of the Cold War, I think, sort of, and then really abandoned its core cases. If I look at sort of who pushed neoliberalism through, It was the Democrats in the US under Clinton. It was Schröder in Germany, the Social Democrats. It was Blair with this third way in Britain. Policies that are, I would argue, have nothing to do with social democratic policies. And so maybe something similar again, you mentioned it, and I agree, we saw with Occupy Wall Street that the establishment, kind of the normal people that sit at the kitchen table, sort of, who they were not, the Pelosi's and the Clintons did not take anything up of what Occupy Wall Street asked. Quite the opposite. You get the bailout of banks and whatnot before. And with Sanders, you could make an argument too that, they had to cook quite a bit to get him not elected as candidate, right? Sort of with these, I forgot the names, they have these super electors in that. So the left really, and I think that, and then the other element also, I just want to sort of underline what I think you said, that so what's then the narrative? What's then what do I offer? What do I offer sort of people in a certain sense? And the right here in the US or in parts of Europe, has the story of, well, I'll bring you back to German glory. I bring you back sort of something you can believe in, and the who is wrong, who's mistaken is the Turkish or Syrian worker who doesn't belong here, or the Mexican who are coming here and taking your jobs, and so there's a story that the left, the established left so far has not really been able, I think, to counter in any way because they destroyed or were helping to destroy so much that was the left, from trade unionism. Because again, if we think about trade unionism, right, it wasn't only lobbying for better wages. It used to be sort of the school for the working class with like clubs. And I mean, in former Yugoslavia, how, there was the whole infrastructure. It was not only sort of a lobbying group for better wages. It was sort of actually sort of schools and meetings and union halls and so on. And that is all, gone with great help, I would argue, by established left. I mean, that's my best attempt sort of to reply. Yeah. And so I agree with what you said. And so that's why, what in this recent, well, it's not so a couple of years ago, sort of paper that we wrote was sort of the trying to understand sort of how to build a new narrative, right? How to build a new kind of idea that can bind these splintered groups from those that kind of, free the whales to, your kind of your classic labor union person, and internationally also sort of, I think is key to counter that narrative of the sort of the alt-right, which I agree, sort of, at least again, sort of only looking at Germany and France, often has similarities in their analysis of what the problem is, but in their policies, if you actually look at sort of the policy program of the Alternative for Germany, that's sort of the right, they're neoliberal policies, right? I mean, they're not there to sort of increase the well-being of the working class. Again, sort of for me, reflecting, and I'm not at all saying that the AfD is anything like the National Socialists, but a similar kind of policy, right? There's very little socialism in National Socialism of the Nazis, I would argue, but I'll stop here. Thank you for your insight. I think that I agree with it.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Anastas. Okay, let's see. We have 5 more minutes. So if somebody else would like to use the opportunity to ask a question or share a comment, or if they disagree with some of the points or still have difficulty.
Please also disagree. That leads to discussion.
So that we can also be mindful of Peter's time and, end up also on time. So Peter, are you okay? 5 more minutes?
Yeah, of course. Happy to.
May I jump in?
Yes, Rajan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. You have really provided great insights. I mean, it's pretty much like on the global scale. But one of the things that you have mentioned in the beginning was actually that you have said that a lot of movements are actually going more locally rather than staying on a global scale, which reminded me of like understanding that we have this war increasing globally, which is like something that is in trending everywhere. So basically that is something that we globally come together. But when it comes to the other issues, I see also that people are more organizing themselves around the local issues rather than going on the national level. And one of the things that you and Anastas have speak about the right and the left wings. I mean, I have been working with the CSOs for many years, almost 2 decades. And what I have seen in the last 2 or 3 years is actually the far right is actually advocating to decrease of the funding for the research, for the science, and for the civil society. So basically giving the power to these who've been advocating for improvement and sustainability of the world, not only speaking about the vulnerable populations, but basically about, you know, the general status and the context of the societies. And also speaking with the youth in the last, you know, couple of months, what I was seeing, because one of the questions was, I was working on the environmental issue. So basically one of the questions was, like, do you consider environmental risk as something you want to move out of your country, like, you know, going abroad, because you see that the governments do not like do nothing, you know, fixing that. But basically a lot of them said basically they want to stay and fix that locally rather than just moving, you know, away from the problem, which is like, for me, from my age, is, you know, it's completely different context. And it gives me just another level of understanding that we have the new wave of this, not necessarily activists, but, you know, the new generation that are willing to commit to fixing the problems, and also like doing it for free. Because I was asking like about the funding and the projects, excuse me, and they said like that doesn't matter. I mean, we want just to make, you know, have the future which is like more sustainable, healthy, clean, and so on. So it is just, you know, the other context of the, you know, my understanding around the everything, and comparing to the, you know, weaponizing societies and going into the world like day by day, when on the other side, like the scientists are being left without that much funding to actually, you know, come with different research and then the innovations basically contributing to sustainable world. And thank you so much again for the global context of the problem.
No, thank you. This is very insightful. Of course, we see similar things in the US, right, sort of happening.
Peter, would you mind if Anastas adds one
please.
more question? He just messaged you on chat. I don't. He has just one.
Please,
another.
Of course. Or comment, question, anything.
So it's again a question. The other thing I wanted to ask is, so we mentioned the Zapatistas and all that, and how inspiring they have been also for like as a source of diffusion of ideas and all that. Do you have an impression? I have an impression that social movements since the Zapatistas have become much more Western centric, and you know, I think by being local doesn't also it also doesn't imply like to just look like you care about the local stuff, but you see globally. And I think this was you know, this was one of the most poignant things about the global social justice movement. But I haven't seen much. But maybe that's my impression. Like there is always this fascination. Oh, something is happening. I don't know, in Nepal, something is happening there. But it's like cursory curiosity, but nothing that kind of has the similar magnitude like EZLN. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, you know, I'm not a Zapatista specialist by any stretch of the imagination, but I agree with you. I think that I don't really. It seems there's nothing equivalent to them anymore. But I think that also had to do with that they really did things on so many levels in these different ways, as you remember, right? I mean, first of all, they spoke in this poetic way. They had these symbols of Subkommandante Marcos, sort of everyone was Marcos, right? Sort of, again, sort of the contrasting to sort of the hierarchical structures of political parties, maybe, or revolutionary movements. So I think sort of one that seemed to follow, not in the same sexiness, but follow was maybe Morales's MAS in Bolivia, you know, that was just voted out of power, of course, sort of one of his followers. So that kind of comes to mind. But then also with Bolivia, but also with Venezuela under Chavez, there were Syriza, you mentioned, right? There were these then, in a certain sense, you could think about it, maybe sort of the next step of the Zapatistas is taking state power somehow. But then sort of there, it seems they haven't really delivered in ways that ignite imagination. Sort of Syriza is such a, you know, great example of, at the end of the day, unfortunately, it seems failure, right? Podemos in Spain. So no, I mean, no, I agree with you. I wouldn't. I mean, is there? Well, let me ask the group. I'm curious. Is there sort of maybe the Serbian youth movement, right? Is sort of, you know, but is there sort of something that sparks kind of the global, maybe even imagination in a certain sense of sort of
maybe more within the region,
like, yeah.
because after students mobilized last summer, I know in Croatia there was also not necessarily students, but there was people who organized to protest, like to boycott actually certain products because of this big chains and like prices, and I think it was also an issue with inflation and just like the dispossession and kind of like some sort of injustices within society later on. And that's more recently in Sarajevo, also youth predominantly, they organized after a tragedy that took one young life away. The person, the young artist who was hit by a train, like the city train, and so that sparked it. It triggered also, like organization. But it goes back to the point that you raised, and it's so important. And maybe you can add a little bit to that because it was so insightful when you distinguish between mobilizing and organizing. Because somehow I feel also in Serbia and elsewhere, mobilization takes place, and rightly so. And like you have hybrid groups, not necessarily youth, not necessarily working class, not necessarily, like it's a combination of people, different groups within every society. And there is often even the transnational solidarity, because I was at that time in the States, and I remember we also in St. Petersburg organized in solidarity with student demands in Serbia. And it was not only Serbians there, but it was, like quite diverse group who joined. So that was interesting. But like sustaining and organizing, kind of like having some sort of like infrastructure and the narrative, and like when you reference to those like labor unions and like the infrastructure, and like having your voice heard and like sustaining this channel of communication, that's where things become a little difficult and messy. So yes, or mobilizing, yes, but organizing, I think it's been a challenge even here in the Balkans, in this region.
I think that's quite, sort of that's the way I think about these No Kings protests, right? 8 million people supposedly were on the street of the US, which is massive, but that's mobilizing, and organizing is so much harder and so much more, the distinction that in social movement studies between kind of the visible and the latent phases of movements, right? Sort of what we see is from the riot porn to kind of, we see the protest and then it's gone. But the real work, of course, is in the organizing, the everyday, the meetings. And for that, I think at least, but we all have, positional objectivities, I guess. For me, in that case, sort of labor unions have to be part of it because they have these structures in place. They have, or can be, right? And that I think is also one of the reasons why, especially here in Florida, or also here in Florida, they go after unions, right? In that way, because it's a real, or could be, let's say. And I'm not saying at all, there's a lot of co-optation of labor leaders and labor. And so I'm not at all, that's not the panacea for it, but it is at least something that has structures in place to kind of work with in a certain sense. But I think that distinction, as you mentioned, Dragana, I think that's a really important one to kind of analyze and to sort of understand the potentiality also of kind of protests or movements, right? Sort of immobilizing is, or just immobilizing, certainly different than organizing. I think the same is sort of with, often in the media it's portrayed, all these spontaneous protests. Rarely are they spontaneous. Most of the time, things have been in place for many years, and people tap into sort of different kind of configurations of it. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, anybody else? Would you like to add something before we close for today?
I just want to thank you. This was wonderful. I learned and heard, and unfortunately, I couldn't be there. I was looking forward to coming to to former Yugoslavia, but maybe sometime in the future. But thank you again
Yeah,
for
it's here. Sanya is
entertaining me.
here, and I think she has the voice. Maybe, you know, like a suggestion for next year to allow some guests to really come and be physically in Rijeka or Belgrade or Sarajevo. But I know Anastas mentioned, because I saw him in Croatia last month, he will be in Sarajevo in June. So Peter, if you come, you guys can continue.
That's good that you remember.
You
I
can
wanted to
continue
submit.
conversation
Yes, I would
and the
love to go.
dialogue there.
It's a beautiful area and a beautiful part of Europe, and I hope so. In any case, thank you very much for entertaining me, and it was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
I appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.